And now to explore how healthcare providers and patient communities can work together to improve rare disease treatments, I'm pleased to be joined by a real great panel of experts. Annie Kennedy is Chief of Policy Advocacy and Patient Engagement for EveryLife Foundation for Rare Diseases. Paige Rivard is CEO of the Prader-Willi Syndrome Association, USA, where she advocates on behalf of patients with the genetic multisystem disorder. For awareness, Prader-Willi Syndrome Association, USA has a relationship with this event's sponsor, has shared information on their clinical trials. I think that's great. And Dr. Mustafa Sahin is the director of the Translational Neuroscience Center at Boston Children's Hospital. He specializes in studying rare genetic disorders that can cause autism and intellectual abilities. Thank you all for joining me today. Paige, let me start with you. And you are a parent of a child who has two genetic disorders. And my understanding is that Prader-Willi syndrome is in our community in America about 20,000 cases. Maybe that's global. I don't know whether it's global or domestic, but I'm trying to give our audience an understanding of the size of community. It's a limited number of people, which changes the dynamic. And I am very committed today to kind of having people share the human story side of this. You're a mom. You've been dealing with this. Can you just give our audience an understanding of some of the stress points, particularly during COVID, that you and your family have had, and what other families who have those who suffer from rare diseases are experiencing in this time?
Sure. Hi. Thank you for having me, Steve. Yes, I am a mom. My son is 11. He is in 5th grade. He has two genetic disorders, Prader-Willi syndrome and neurofibromatosis, or NF1. And, 11 years ago, we had never heard of either of these. I should say my husband is a physician. He's heard of them, but we had no knowledge of what it was like to live with a rare genetic disorder. So it has impacted our lives greatly, changed our lives completely, to be very honest. I come from a banking world. My last 20 years of my professional life was in banking. I actually had to quit my job because I traveled a lot for that job. I couldn't continue with taking care of my son. And so, it has impacted us from that perspective. It's also impacted his sibling. We have a daughter who is 23, and, she obviously 11-year span difference between them, but she grew up with, our son's name is Jake, and just learning to live with this. She's actually chosen a career that's going to be working with special needs individuals, but it's greatly impacted our family. COVID has really impacted our family as well as, all of the rare disease community. There have been a lot of things, from just travel to care, clinical trials. The biggest impact for our family is really in school. March 2020, I took this role and my son's school went remote. And so I had to figure out how to juggle a new job and how to help him access his education via, remote learning. He was not good at remote learning. It was a big struggle for him. He requires an aide with him daily. So we had a lot of struggle. He has actually regressed quite a bit. So we are now in the process of tutoring just to try to catch him back up. He's in 5th grade, but we're doing, in addition to school, he has his tutor twice a week. He also has multiple therapies, occupational therapy, speech, physical therapy that he goes to. So it's been interesting, and it's been a journey. And I think you talk to any rare disease family, and it's very similar.
Well, I'm very grateful that you shared with us a lot of that, the challenge and the stress of that. And Annie Kennedy, at the EveryLife Foundation for Rare Diseases, I'm interested in this report that you generated covering, as I understand, if my notes are right, about 379 rare diseases affecting 15.5 million people in the United States, and looking, to kind of look at the burden again, almost $1 trillion of extra healthcare burden on those people in this space. And I think there are two dimensions, from my conversation with Josh Gottheimer, as this comes into greater clarity for me. There's the stress on the family, on the patient that Paige just shared with us. Then there's the stress on research, getting people to clinical trials, getting to clinical endpoints, getting to what the FDA requires. And I'd love you to kind of share with us, given your role in helping to look across this, what are the elements we really have to fix and get to know, particularly with the impact of COVID?
Yeah, I'm delighted to. And first of all, I love that whole conversation that you had with Representative Gottheimer, and that juxtaposed with what Paige just shared. The whole reason we did that study that you just described was because we know that families, like Paige's family, like my family, like so many families, know inherently the costs of living with a rare disease are largely actually absorbed by families. So much of what Paige just described are costs that are not actually reimbursed by the healthcare system. But we actually spend a lot of time in Washington talking about direct costs, talking about investment, and talking about costs in the healthcare system. But we have actually never done formalized studies actually looking at what the whole cost of living with a rare disease is. The other thing that you actually were just speaking about previously was really important, and that rare is actually not rare. And that while we talk about an estimated 30 million Americans living with rare disease, we believe that's a conservative estimate because that's based on the people we can count, those we have what are known as ICD codes for, or International Classification of Diseases codes for. And the reason we only looked at 379 diseases is because we don't have ICD codes for all 7,000 to 10,000 rare diseases. So many patients in the system or many rare disease community members are invisible in our system. So we had to start somewhere. So that $1 trillion number that we talked about was in 2019, so before the pandemic, before costs actually exacerbated for families. And 60% of those costs are costs incurred directly out of pocket by families. They're not the costs that you see in inpatient, outpatient visits. They're not prescription costs. They're the unreimbursed costs that are required for caring for an individual or yourself if you're living with a rare disease that are directly out of pocket for families. And what we've also now found through that data is that the economic impact of rare diseases is equal to or greater than most chronic diseases in the US. And why this is so important for us is because the investment into solving for these rare diseases at NIH, at FDA, and other public health programs is de minimis. And so it's really important to us that we begin to shift that conversation and talk about the fact that rare is not somebody else's problem. It's not just the concern of our rare disease community, family members. It should be an economic priority for Americans, for all of us, to really invest in rare disease research and resources in the same way that we've invested in solving for the pandemic and cancer and diabetes and many of the conditions that matter to all of us, because rare disease matters to all of us.
Really, really important observations. Dr. Sahin, at Boston Children's Hospital, I learned that the very first patient admitted to your hospital with COVID was actually a rare disease patient who lived in a shared facility. It's just a reminder of some of these conditions that can be such a challenge. But I'm interested in something Josh Gottheimer talked about and kind of the world that you're both in treating patients, but you're also part of the research community. And Josh Gottheimer said, hey, we need to keep getting shots on goal, shots on goal, shots on goal. My question to you is, what's getting in the way of getting more shots on goal in the rare disease arena?
Well, there are a number of obstacles. The important point scientifically is that many of these rare diseases are genetic diseases. And we know from the revolution that occurred in genetics and the technologies that we can identify these patients with remarkable precision to the base pair that they have this potential variation in their DNA. And that allows us a whole slew of potential therapies. So in terms of being close to therapies, rare diseases are an amazing opportunity for us. Having said that, because of not having the infrastructure, but also lacking the funding for these rare diseases, we're not able to take those shots on the goal. We have to take more shots on the goal. There's no question about that. But it is very difficult for these disorders to convince large pharmaceutical companies, if they don't have enough patients, for instance, for that disease, to be commercially interested in that disease. It's also very difficult for investigators to get funding from the NIH for clinical trials for these rare diseases. There's a number of obstacles that are in the way. And I think if we take that global perspective of the amazing impact of these diseases, combined with the unique opportunity that they might be more amenable to treatment with the technologies that we're developing, that combination, I think, makes the very strong argument that we have to take more shots on the goal, both from funding perspective, but also from the infrastructure perspective. And it's going to take not just industry, it's not going to take just academia, it's not going to just take patient advocacy organizations, but a combined effort for a combination of these rare diseases. The other point I want to make is that for many of these rare diseases, we are taking one disease at a time approach. And that really creates, as you understand, the number of rare diseases that we're dealing with, a potential limitation to what we can achieve. If we can leverage what we learn from one disease with a larger group of diseases, if we can look at comparative studies among these rare diseases, we might be able to make progress in a quicker and more efficient way. So I'm particularly interested in efforts, maybe global efforts like the cancer initiatives that President Biden started, that takes a bigger picture perspective of looking at a number of rare diseases together.
Look, Doctor, I'll address this to all of you. I've been moderating healthcare events now, I don't know, probably for about 20 years. Before the iPhone was around, before we had a lot of the technology that surrounds our daily lives, before telehealth was a big deal. And I just sort of always felt like each year, incrementally, both technology, community building, communications, commuter networks, everything was moving in a good direction, getting a little bit better, a little bit bolder. We were getting greater efficaciousness, even in things like cancer. But now I have to say that, from the data I've been looking at, the last 2 years have been horrible and almost a reversal, where you look at things like clinical trial participation and enrollment in areas. And I've got data that shows, in year-over-year data in, according to therapeutic areas, endocrine areas, 80% decrease in participation during this COVID period, cardiovascular 70% decrease, oncology 48% decrease. And so to me, those are staggering numbers. And I guess my question is, how much of a gut punch, how wobbly are our efforts in research now? I think before we could kind of had confidence in incrementalism. What do we need to fix now? Because this seems like some gaping wounds in our research momentum and in our footprint, our connectivity with patients. And I think part of this is asking the question today of whether the public policy community here in Washington should do something to fix the impacts of this so that this fragile funding and research system doesn't come undone. I know it's a little bit long-winded, but I want to get it out there. This is a real serious time. But let me just start with you, Doctor. Do you feel that there have been serious impacts from COVID?
The impact of COVID on research has been huge, and we're just starting to feel it. It's going to have a downstream impact for a number of years, not just on ongoing current trials, but also on the training and upcoming leaders of the field in the future are going to be affected with the COVID pandemic and their research. So just to be very clear, as of March 2020, our lab completely closed. We couldn't do any research experiments in the lab. It took us several months to get back up to where we were, and we're barely really coming back to where we were before the pandemic in terms of the experiments that we were hoping to do. So from that perspective, the impact has been huge. From clinical trials perspective, many clinical trials had to stop because patients could not travel. So just for our trial, which was on a rare disease that happened around April 2020, we had to change completely our assessment system from in-person assessments to telehealth assessments, and we had to do that within weeks. And with the passionate commitment of the patients in that particular rare disease, we were actually able to finish that trial. So I'm very proud that we learned some things and we were able to pivot very quickly and finish that trial. So there are some actually learnings from COVID that I think will help access to clinical trials going forward, including telehealth, including access, including doing trials in a different way that we might be able to get results quicker. But I'm extremely worried about the impact of COVID on research, especially clinical research, including the training of our next generation of leaders who are going to continue this research in the future.
Thank you. Paige, I'd love to get a snapshot from you as well as to how the community you're working so hard to support has been impacted. And I guess I want to ask you a question, which is, as you advocate for patients in your network, as you're trying to raise resources to build a community, what do you need all of us to do? What of us outside this? What would make your world move forward more constructively? What would be some of the things on your roadmap that you want the world to hear?
Well, as Dr. Sahin mentioned, obviously clinical trials have been impacted greatly, in the rare disease community. We're in a good place for Prader-Willi syndrome. We actually have a lot of pharma companies interested in the disease and working towards clinical trials. But I think, we have a limited number of population to participate in those trials. So education about clinical trials is important. Also, as he said, we all have to work together. We have been to the FDA a few times. I believe they have a good understanding of the unmet need of Prader-Willi syndrome, but we really need to do more and work harder and faster. So it's going to take all of us. It's going to take the advocacy groups. It's going to take the medical groups, academia, everyone to really take an interest and understand and have a desire to do the research that's going to be needed to give our loved ones, their best life possible.
Thank you. Annie, finally you, and then we've got an audience question for you. But Annie, I want to tell our audience that you helped lead legislative efforts around, I think it was the MD Care Act, the Patient-Focused Impact Assessment Act. You know legislation and lobbying. You know what this town can do, and you know what this town's limits and failings are. But I guess the question I have from a structural, I was just asking Josh Gottheimer, should the clock stop on exclusivity? Is that does that change the game at all on the research side, for those companies, who may or may not be investors in this, where there's a fragility, I understand, in this arena. But from a legislative perspective of looking at that architecture, maybe we're going to lose our audience because we're going to get wonky right now. But, I think the question is, what are the items on the agenda that you think matter to this topic that we should know about, that we should think about? Josh Gottheimer mentioned a few, but what's on your playlist?
I love this question. And we actually have about 1,300 advocates coming to the Hill next week to talk about this. This matters a lot to us. And I don't think we'll lose the audience because I think this matters to people. I think the concept of time is really important in rare disease. Time is a commodity to our families and those living with rare disease. And I love the idea of stopping the clock as far as exclusivity is concerned, but the clock will not stop for somebody who is living with a rare disease, who daily is facing irreversible disease progression. And one of the things that happened, as my co-panelists were talking about, as we saw delays and the trials stop, and the same people at FDA and NIH who were having to apply themselves to the urgency of the COVID pandemic, as they should have, were the same people who typically are reviewing and moving forward products in rare disease. And what happens when those pipelines stall and slow is actually a generation of patients with a rare disease will lose the opportunity to benefit from that pipeline. So not only are we talking about a generation of future researchers, we're talking about a generation of children or adults who could have benefited from a therapy, and we don't get that back. And so when we talk about potential solutions, the first thing we have to do is we have to protect the incentives we already have that are working. So you were talking earlier to Representative Gottheimer about the orphan drug tax credit. It's working. And there have been proposals made recently that will disincentivize or harm the existing orphan drug tax credit incentive. We cannot take additional cuts to the orphan drug tax credit. We have to make sure that the companies working in our space continue to invest in our space and incentivize them further. The accelerated approval pathway and regulatory review pathways that are tailored to rare disease and targeted rare diseases are working. We have data to show that. We need to protect and strengthen those pathways and continue to incentivize researchers investors, therapy developers to come into the space. But the other thing we saw happen during COVID is we saw rapid real-time data sharing occur that we believed previously couldn't happen. And we need to see that continue. Some of the early symptoms we learned were associated with COVID. The loss of taste came from patient registries. So we saw patient experience data informing the clinical trials and the regulatory decisions. We need to see more of that in rare disease, in real-time decision-making. And we need to see regulatory statute that supports that. Patient experience is data, it is quantifiable, and it counts. And I know you'll have panelists on later that talk about that. But that regulatory certainty is needed for companies to have confidence they can proactively pursue these innovations. And we need legislation that gives them cover to do that. So overall, we just need more investment, more hope, more innovation, and more access for the rare disease community.
Well, I think that just grew our audience because audiences love to hear specificity and roadmaps. And so thank you very much, Annie. We have an audience question from Alec Stone. Alec?
Thank you. As the Public Affairs Director for the Oncology Nursing Society, the professional organization that represents the interests of the 110 U.S. oncology nurses, I witnessed our members serve on the front lines of this public health emergency. The pandemic continues to have a devastating impact on patients, particularly those with immunocompromised systems. Now, more than ever, rare diseases, including rare cancers, need to have the support of federal agencies in order to find breakthrough treatments and cures. As the most trusted profession for 2 decades in a row, how can nurses help educate public officials and regulatory agencies in these areas?
What a great question. Thank you, Alec. So, Dr. Sahin, Mustafa, how can nurses be brought into this equation constructively and effectively?
Nurses have been an incredible partner in this process, not just in the clinic, but also on the research side. We couldn't do much of what we do without the nurses. I started our rare disease clinic with just one nurse back in 2002, and she's been with us as a pioneer in this field, if you will, for the past 20 years and knows that community better than I do. So I think she's been a member of the patient advocacy group, clinic committee, for instance, and working in that role. I agree completely that nurses are an important population to bring into this. I also want to highlight the fact, as was mentioned by the nurse colleague, that individuals with rare diseases, because of their medical conditions, have been carrying a disproportionate portion of the infections with COVID, and not just because of cancer, but immunodeficiencies, genetic forms of immunodeficiencies, genetic forms of lung disease. And also remember, about 3/4 of the rare diseases affect the central nervous system, the brain. So that comes with developmental delay, intellectual disability, autism, weakness, all reasons that you might be more vulnerable to this COVID pandemic. And those patients and those families have been disproportionately affected with this pandemic, unfortunately. So bring that to the forefront, having policy colleagues come and see our specialty clinics, seeing our patients, seeing the research that we're doing, I think would be a very powerful way to get the word out. And programs like this, obviously, hopefully will be another way to get the word out about this disproportionate burden that these families are carrying during the pandemic.
Right. Oh, Paige and Annie, I would love to get your quick thoughts on the role of nurses as well. Paige?
Sure, I agree with Dr. Sahin. Nurses, are integral in everything we do, all of our clinic visits, but I think just the continued education and spotlight on rare disease. I know our organization does a lot with NICU. A lot of our patients are diagnosed in the NICU, so we constantly are reaching out and trying to educate NICUs and nurses and anybody we can. So for us, I think it is the continual education piece that needs to happen.
And finally, Annie.
Yeah, I loved the question. I think nurses are a trusted entity, right? You were talking earlier about really there's some public distrust, public confidence. We've had a lot of different messaging coming from a lot of different places during the pandemic. But there are some workforces that are undeniably those who were heroes and continue to be during the pandemic and that people trust. And I think as the rare disease community really grapples with what now, what happens during this phase of the pandemic. We know the pandemic is not over, and as mask mandates are being lifted and people are trying to return to whatever this new normal looks like, a lot of the members of the rare disease community, for all the reasons our panelists talked about, are really scared and are really worried about what this means for us. And I think the more that we can partner with trusted organizations, trusted entities, trusted workforces and communities around public messaging, around the fact that mask mandates may not be lifted for all, around what safe looks like for some members of our community, the better that will be for all of us. And that is something that I love the question, and really excites me to think about what types of partnerships and collaborations we could think about looking forward.
Terrific conversation, terrific question. Alex Stone, thank you so much. I really want to thank our panelists, Annie Kennedy, Chief of Policy, Advocacy and Patient Engagement for the EveryLife Foundation for Rare Diseases. Please go check out their report. It's fascinating and important. Paige Rivard is CEO of the Prader-Willi Syndrome Association, USA, and Dr. Mustafa Sahin is the Director of the Translational Neuroscience Center at Boston Children's Hospital. Really appreciate your time. What a great conversation. I hope we don't just have these conversations around World Rare Disease Day, which, folks, is on Monday. I hope we can have them other times during the year and, take this seriously all year long. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.